On July 11, 1944, a Douglas C-47 transport aircraft landed at Hollandia Airfield in New Guinea, carrying the most famous pilot in the world. Charles Lindbergh, 42 years old, stepped onto the crushed coral runway wearing khaki work clothes and carrying a single duffel bag. No military uniform, no rank insignia, just a civilian technical consultant from United Aircraft Corporation. The 5th Air Force fighter pilots watched him arrive with something between curiosity and contempt. Lindbergh had flown across the Atlantic solo in 1927, 17 years ago. Ancient history. What could a 42-year-old civilian possibly teach combat pilots about flying P-38 Lightnings in 1944? The answer was simple. Everything. The Pacific Theater had a fuel problem. American fighter aircraft couldn't reach Japanese targets. The distances were too great. P-38 Lightnings had an official combat radius of 450 miles. That meant 450 miles out, 450 miles back, plus reserves for combat. Total mission range approximately 1,300 miles. Sounds like a lot. It wasn't. Japanese air bases at Wewak, Hollandia, and Rabaul were all within that range, but targets farther north weren't. Halmahera was 600 miles away. The Philippines were 800 miles. The P-38s couldn't reach them. B-24 heavy bombers could fly those distances, but they needed fighter escort. Without fighters, Japanese Zeros would shred the bomber formations. The solution seemed obvious. Build more air bases closer to Japanese territory. Except building air bases took months. Engineers, construction equipment, supply ships, time the Allies didn't have. General Douglas MacArthur wanted to invade the Philippines by October 1944. That was 3 months away. The 5th Air Force needed longer-range fighters immediately. United Aircraft Corporation thought they had the answer. Their engineers believed P-38 pilots were flying inefficiently, wasting fuel, operating engines at too high RPM and manifold pressure, burning 100 gallons per hour when they could burn 60. The difference meant 400 extra miles of range, maybe more. United Aircraft sent their best technical consultant to prove it, Charles Lindbergh. He'd spent 17 years working with aircraft manufacturers, developing high-altitude flight techniques, optimizing engine performance, testing experimental aircraft. He knew more about long-range flying than any pilot alive, because he'd done it, solo, across the Atlantic, 3,600 miles, in 1927, in an aircraft everyone said couldn't make the distance. Lindbergh had ignored the experts then. He was about to do it again. Colonel Charles MacDonald commanded the 475th Fighter Group at Hollandia. His pilots flew P-38s. They had the highest kill ratio in the Pacific Theater. They were good. They knew they were good. And they didn't appreciate a civilian showing up to tell them how to fly. MacDonald met Lindbergh at the operations tent. He was polite, professional, but skeptical. MacDonald asked what Lindbergh planned to do. Lindbergh said he wanted to fly combat missions with the squadron, observe how pilots operated their aircraft, then teach them fuel-saving techniques. MacDonald almost laughed. Fly combat missions? Lindbergh was a civilian. Civilians didn't fly combat. They weren't authorized. They weren't insured. If Lindbergh got shot down, it would be an international incident. The Japanese would parade America's greatest pilot as a propaganda trophy. Washington would be furious. Lindbergh understood the concern. He had a solution. Don't tell Washington. MacDonald stared at him. You want me to let a civilian fly combat missions without authorization? Lindbergh nodded. MacDonald should have said no. He should have told Lindbergh to observe from the ground, write reports, conduct briefings, stay safe. But MacDonald didn't say no. Because the 475th Fighter Group had a problem. They were running out of fuel on every long-range mission. Pilots were landing with 20 gallons remaining, sometimes less. Sometimes they didn't make it back. Running out of fuel over the ocean meant ditching. Most pilots didn't survive. If Lindbergh could solve the fuel problem, MacDonald would risk the political fallout. He told Lindbergh he could fly, but only as an observer. No engaging enemy aircraft, no combat, just fly and watch. The squadron pilots heard about Lindbergh that evening. Most reactions were negative. Who cares what he did in 1927? This is 1944. Combat flying is different. The Atlantic crossing was a publicity stunt. This is war. One pilot said it perfectly. Spirit of St. Louis didn't have Zeros shooting at it. The comment got laughs, but Major Thomas McGuire wasn't laughing. McGuire had 31 kills. He would later have 38 before his fatal crash in January 1945. But in July 1944, he was the squadron's top ace. And he was curious, not about Lindbergh's fame, about his fuel numbers. United Aircraft claimed their technique would extend range by 40 km. McGuire calculated what that meant. Current maximum range, 1,300 miles. With 40% increase, 1,820 miles. That put Halmahera in range, maybe even southern Philippines. If Lindbergh could deliver those numbers, McGuire didn't care if he was a civilian. He wanted to learn. Lindbergh flew his first mission on July 13th, a routine patrol, 4 P-38s flying a defensive pattern over Allied shipping lanes. Lindbergh flew wing position. His job was to follow and observe. The mission lasted 3 hours. When they landed, Lindbergh's fuel gauge showed 140 gallons remaining. The other 3 pilots showed 60 gallons, 55 gallons, and 48 gallons. Lindbergh had used 30% less fuel flying the exact same mission. Same speed, same altitude, same formation position. How? The other pilots wanted to know. Lindbergh explained his technique. It sounded simple, too simple. Lower RPM, higher manifold pressure, lean the fuel mixture, operate the engines at maximum efficiency rather than maximum power. The pilots were skeptical. Lower RPM meant less power. Less power meant slower speed. Slower speed meant being vulnerable to enemy fighters. Lindbergh explained it differently. The P-38 had 2 power settings, combat power and cruise power. Combat power was 20,600 RPM and 50 inches of manifold pressure, maximum performance. But combat power burned 100 gallons per hour. You couldn't fly long distances at combat power. You'd run out of fuel. So pilots used reduced power, usually 12,300 RPM and 40 inches manifold pressure. That burned 75 gallons per hour. Better, but still inefficient. Lindbergh's technique was radically different. 250 RPM and 31 inches manifold pressure with a lean fuel mixture. That burned 58 gallons per hour. The pilots said it wouldn't work. The engines would overheat, or lose power, or fail. Lindbergh said he'd been flying that way for 2 days. His engines were fine. Colonel McDonald called a briefing on July 15th. He told the pilots to try Lindbergh's technique on the next long-range mission, see if it worked. The pilots grumbled, but orders were orders. On July 16th, 8 P-38s launched for a patrol mission to Geelvink Bay, 750-mile round trip. The flight would take 5 hours. Using standard techniques, the pilots would land with minimal fuel. Using Lindbergh's technique, they should land with comfortable reserves, if it worked. Captain Fred Harris volunteered to test it properly. He flew Lindbergh's exact power settings, 2,050 RPM, 31 inches manifold pressure, lean mixture. His fuel flow gauge showed 58 gallons per hour, exactly as Lindbergh predicted. Harris watched his engine temperatures carefully. They stayed normal, no overheating, no roughness. The engines ran smooth. The formation reached Geelvink Bay at 11:20. They flew defensive patrol for 90 minutes, no enemy contact. At 12:50, they turned for home. Harris checked his fuel. He had 280 gallons remaining, plenty for the return flight with reserves. The other pilots who used standard techniques had 220 gallons. Harris had 60 gallons more flying the same mission in the same conditions. The math was undeniable. Lindbergh's technique worked. When they landed at 15:10, Harris had 110 gallons remaining. The other pilots had 40 to 60 gallons. Harris had nearly twice the fuel reserve. The difference could save lives. If you've ever wondered how one person changes an entire military's operating procedures, you're watching it happen. Lindbergh wasn't just teaching fuel efficiency. He was proving that 17 years of experience still mattered. That fame wasn't the same as skill, and that sometimes the outsider sees what the insiders miss. The squadron held another briefing that evening. Every pilot attended. Lindbergh explained his technique in detail. The key was understanding the Allison V1710 engine's efficiency curve. Every engine has an optimal operating range where it produces maximum power per gallon of fuel consumed. For the V1710, that range was 2,000 to 1,200 RPM at 30 to 32 inches manifold pressure. Higher RPM and pressure produced more power but consumed fuel exponentially faster. Lower settings reduced power too much. The sweet spot was narrow. Most pilots had never thought about it. They flew at whatever power setting felt comfortable, usually too high, burning fuel unnecessarily. Lindbergh also explained fuel mixture. The P-38 had automatic mixture control, but the automatic system ran rich. Rich mixtures used more fuel than necessary. Lindbergh manually leaned his mixture at cruise altitude. That reduced fuel consumption by another 8%. Combined with optimal RPM and manifold pressure, the total fuel savings were 35% to 40%, exactly as United Aircraft had predicted. The pilots started asking technical questions. What about engine temperatures? Lindbergh showed his engine temperature logs, normal across all parameters. What about power loss in combat? Lindbergh explained, you didn't use cruise settings in combat. When you spotted enemy aircraft, you pushed the throttles to combat power. Full RPM, full manifold pressure, rich mixture, maximum performance. The technique was only for transit and patrol. One pilot asked the obvious question, why didn't the flight manual include this information? Lindbergh said it did. Page 47, optimal cruise settings for maximum range. But the manual presented the information poorly. Dense technical language, no practical examples. Most pilots never read that section. They learned to fly from instructors, and instructors taught what they'd been taught. Standard power settings that worked but weren't optimal. The inefficiency had become doctrine. Lindbergh was undoing years of institutional practice with basic aeronautical engineering, and it was working. Over the next week, the entire 475th Fighter Group adopted Lindbergh's techniques. Mission range extended from 1,300 miles to 1,850 miles. That opened up new targets, Japanese air bases that were previously unreachable, supply routes that were previously safe. The tactical situation changed overnight. 5th Air Force Headquarters heard about the results. They sent Lindbergh to other P-38 squadrons. The 8th Fighter Group, the 49th Fighter Group, the 475th, every squadron reported the same results. 35% to 40% fuel savings, extended range, fewer fuel emergencies, fewer ditching incidents. Lindbergh's technique was saving aircraft and pilots, but Lindbergh wanted more than just teaching. He wanted to fly combat, real combat, against Japanese fighters. McDonnell kept saying no, too risky, too political. Then on July 27th, intelligence reported a large Japanese formation building up at Amboina Airfield. 60 aircraft, maybe more. They were preparing to attack Allied positions. 5th Air Force planned a preemptive strike. 12 P-38s would strafe the airfield, destroy the Japanese aircraft on the ground. It was a maximum range mission, 900 miles one way, 1,800 miles total. The P-38s would launch with full internal fuel and external drop tanks. Even using Lindbergh's technique, they'd land with minimal reserves. McDonnell told Lindbergh the mission was too dangerous for a civilian. Lindbergh asked what would happen if one pilot didn't return. McDonnell said they'd launch search and rescue. Lindbergh said that burned more fuel, more aircraft at risk. But if all 12 pilots used optimal fuel management, they'd have enough reserves to search for a missing pilot and still make it home. McDonnell understood. Lindbergh wasn't asking to fly combat. He was asking to make the mission safer for everyone. McDonnell approved Lindbergh for the mission. But the same rules applied. Observer only. No engaging enemy aircraft. Stay in formation. Come home safe. The 12 P-38s launched at 06:15 on July 28, 1944. Lindbergh flew in the number 4 position. Second element, wingman slot. The formation climbed to 12,000 feet and turned northwest toward Amboina. Every pilot was using Lindbergh's fuel technique, 2,050 RPM, 31 inches manifold pressure, lean mixture, fuel flow steady at 58 gallons per hour. At that rate, they'd reach Amboina with 240 gallons remaining. Plenty for combat and return flight. The mission would take 6 hours total. Lindbergh settled into the rhythm of long-range flying, scanning the sky, checking instruments, staying in formation. He'd done this before, 17 years ago, alone over the Atlantic. Now he was doing it again, with 11 other pilots, heading toward enemy territory where people would shoot at him. The formation crossed the coast of Seram Island at launch 45. Amboina was 30 miles ahead. Then the radar warning sounded. Enemy aircraft inbound, Zeros climbing from the southeast. The mission had just become combat, and Lindbergh was about to break every rule. McDonald's voice crackled over the radio. Bandits, 4 o'clock low, multiple contacts climbing. Lindbergh looked right and down. 8 dark specks rising through scattered clouds. Japanese Zeros, Mitsubishi A6M fighters. Fast, maneuverable, deadly. The Zero pilots had spotted the American formation. They were climbing to intercept. Standard Japanese tactic, get altitude, attack from above. The P-38 formation was at 12,000 feet. The Zeros were climbing through 8,000. 4,000 feet below, McDonald gave the order. Red flight, maintain altitude, watch the Zeros. If they commit, we engage. Lindbergh's position was Red 4. He was supposed to stay in formation, observe only. But combat doesn't follow plans. The Zeros split into 2 groups. 4 went left, 4 went right. Classic pincer attack, forced the Americans to divide attention. The P-38 formation spread out. Red flight took the left group, blue flight took the right. Lindbergh followed his element leader into a diving turn toward the 4 Zeros on the left. The Japanese fighters were still climbing. They hadn't reached optimal altitude yet. The P-38s had the advantage, speed and position. McDonald led Red flight into a high-speed diving attack. 380 mph. The Zeros saw them coming and scattered. 3 turned away. 1 continued climbing, aggressive pilot or inexperienced, hard to tell. Lindbergh's element leader pursued the climbing Zero. Lindbergh followed. They dove on the target from above and behind. Perfect position. The element leader opened fire at 400 yards. Tracers streamed toward the Zero. Most missed. The deflection angle was wrong. The Zero snap-rolled left and dove. Standard evasion. The element leader followed. Lindbergh stayed on his wing. They pursued the Zero down through 10,000 feet, 8,000, 6,000. The Zero was diving at maximum speed, 320 mph. The P-38s were faster. They closed the gap, 300 yards, 250, 200. The element leader fired again, 3-second burst. Some rounds hit the Zero's tail, not enough to kill it. The Zero pulled up into a chandelle. Climbing turn that bled energy. The maneuver would slow the Zero to 180 mph at the top. Vulnerable. The element leader pulled up to follow, but his P-38 was heavy with fuel. The climb rate was slow. The Zero completed the chandelle and dove again. Now the Zero was behind the P-38. Wrong position. Lindbergh saw the problem immediately. His element leader was in trouble. The Zero had reversed the situation. Now the Japanese pilot had the advantage. He was closing for a gun solution. Lindbergh should have called a warning and continued following his leader. That was doctrine. Stay in formation, don't break off. But doctrine assumed both pilots were equally skilled. Lindbergh wasn't sure his element leader could shake the Zero, and if the Zero killed the element leader, the mission would fail. Someone would have to search for survivors. That would burn fuel other pilots didn't have. The math was simple. Lindbergh could save his element leader by engaging the Zero, breaking the rules, but saving fuel overall. He made his choice in 2 seconds. Lindbergh pulled his P-38 into a hard climbing turn. The maneuver put him above and behind the Zero. The Japanese pilot was focused on the element leader. He didn't see Lindbergh. Classic mistake. Target fixation. The Zero pilot wanted the kill in front of him. He ignored the threat behind him. Lindbergh rolled inverted and pulled through into a split S. The maneuver converted altitude into speed. The P-38 dove at 420 mph. Lindbergh closed on the Zero from the 6 o'clock high position. Perfect gun solution, range 300 yards. The Zero filled his gun sight. Lindbergh squeezed the trigger. 450 caliber machine guns and 120mm cannon fired simultaneously. 2-second burst. The tracers converged on the Zero. Rounds punched through the fighter's tail section and fuselage. The Zero's engine started smoking. Black smoke poured from the cowling. The pilot tried to turn away. Too late. The engine seized. The propeller stopped. The Zero glided toward the ocean without power. Lindbergh pulled up and rejoined his element leader. The entire engagement had lasted 40 seconds. The element leader called over the radio. "Thanks you saved me." Lindbergh didn't respond. He'd just violated direct orders. He was a civilian. He wasn't authorized to engage enemy aircraft. He just shot down a Japanese Zero. If Washington found out, there would be consequences. Court-martial for McDonald, diplomatic incident, International scandal. America's most famous pilot had killed a foreign national while operating as an unauthorized combatant. But nobody on the radio seemed concerned. The pilots were focused on the mission. 10 more Zeros were still out there, and Amboina Airfield was 20 miles ahead. The formation regrouped at 10,000 feet. All 12 P-38s accounted for. 0 damage, 1 Zero destroyed. Lindbergh's kill. The pilots didn't discuss it on the radio. Too much other traffic. McDonald led the formation toward Amboina. The airfield appeared through broken clouds at Aero 958, long runway, multiple revetments, aircraft parked everywhere. Intelligence had been correct. 60 Japanese aircraft on the ground, bombers, fighters, transports, target-rich environment. The P-38s dropped their external fuel tanks. The tanks fell away and tumbled toward the jungle below. Each P-38 lost 300 pounds instantly. Performance improved immediately. Faster acceleration, better climb rate, tighter turn radius. Now they were fighters instead of fuel trucks. McDonald split the formation into 3 flights, 4 aircraft per flight. Each flight would strafe the airfield from a different direction, saturate the defenses, destroy as many aircraft as possible, get out before Japanese reinforcements arrived. The first flight dove toward the runway at 11:02. They came in at 380 mph, 50 feet above the ground, guns hammering. 50 caliber rounds walked across parked aircraft, metal shredded, fuel tanks exploded, secondary explosions rippled across the ramp, 3 bombers burning, 4 fighters destroyed. Anti-aircraft fire opened up. The Japanese gunners were good. Tracers filled the sky. 1 P-38 took hits in the left boom. The pilot kept flying. The second flight attacked from the east. They targeted the revetments, concrete bunkers protecting high-value aircraft. The 50 caliber rounds couldn't penetrate concrete, but the 20mm cannons could. Explosive shells punched through the revetment walls. More aircraft burning. Lindbergh's flight attacked from the south, 4 P-38s in line abreast, a wall of firepower 400 yards wide. They came in low and fast. Lindbergh picked a parked bomber, Mitsubishi G4M Betty, large twin-engine aircraft. He centered it in his gun sight and fired. 4-second burst, the longest burst of the mission. The 50 caliber rounds tore through the Betty's wings and fuselage. The 20mm shells hit the fuel tanks. The bomber exploded. Massive fireball. Debris flew 200 feet in the air. Lindbergh pulled up hard to avoid the explosion. G-forces pushed him into his seat. His vision narrowed. Gray tunnel. He eased back on the stick. The gray faded. Normal vision returned. He'd pulled 6 Gs at 42 years old. Most pilots blacked out at 5 Gs. Lindbergh's conditioning was exceptional. The 3 strafing passes destroyed 31 Japanese aircraft on the ground, plus Lindbergh's 0 kill in the air. 32 enemy aircraft destroyed in 8 minutes. 0 American losses. The mission was successful. Now they had to get home. McDonald called for formation at 11:10. All 12 P-38s climbed to 12,000 feet and turned southeast, back toward Hollandia, 900 miles, 6 hours of flying. Lindbergh checked his fuel. He had 198 gallons remaining. At 58 gallons per hour cruise consumption, that gave him 3.4 hours of fuel. Not enough. The return flight would take 6 hours. He recalculated. The P-38 had consumed more fuel during combat maneuvering. The strafing passes, the dogfight with the Zero. High-speed flying burned fuel faster. Lindbergh adjusted his power settings, lower RPM, lower manifold pressure, ultra-lean mixture. He reduced consumption to 52 gallons per hour. That gave him 3.8 hours of fuel. Still not enough. Then Lindbergh realized the solution. The P-38's internal fuel capacity was 410 gallons. But most pilots never filled the tanks completely. They left 10 or 15 gallons of space to prevent overflow. Lindbergh had supervised his own fueling. He'd filled the tanks to maximum capacity, 410 gallons exactly. That extra 15 gallons gave him 17 minutes of flight time. Combined with reduced consumption, Lindbergh calculated he'd land with 35 gallons remaining. Tight, but survivable. The other pilots weren't so lucky. They'd filled their tanks normally, and they'd burned more fuel during combat. Several pilots reported 180 gallons remaining. At standard cruise consumption of 75 gallons per hour, they had 2.4 hours of fuel for a 6-hour flight. The math didn't work. McDonald called for a fuel check at 11:30. Each pilot reported their remaining fuel. The numbers were bad. 3 pilots had less than 170 gallons. At current consumption, they'd run out of fuel 200 miles from Hollandia. Ditching was inevitable, unless they changed something. Lindbergh keyed his radio. He told McDonald to order all pilots to switch to maximum efficiency cruise settings. 2,000 RPM, 30 inches manifold pressure, ultra-lean mixture. McDonald hesitated. That would reduce speed to 210 mph. Japanese fighters could catch them. Lindbergh said there were no Japanese fighters. They'd destroyed the Zeros at Amboina. The sky was clear. Fuel management was the priority. McDonald gave the order. All pilots switched to efficiency cruise. The formation slowed to 210 mph. Fuel consumption dropped from 75 gallons per hour to 54 gallons per hour. The 3 pilots with low fuel recalculated their range. They'd make it, barely. The entire formation would reach Hollandia with 30 to 50 gallons remaining. Enough for landing. No reserves, but alive. The flight continued southeast. Hours passed. Lindbergh monitored his engine instruments constantly. Temperatures normal, oil pressure normal, fuel flow steady at 52 gallons per hour. The technique was working. At 14:45, the New Guinea coastline appeared. Home. The pilots felt relief. They were going to make it. Hollandia Airfield was visible at 15:10. McDonald led the formation into landing pattern. Lindbergh landed at 15:22. His fuel gauge showed 38 gallons remaining, more than predicted. The last pilot landed at 15:28 with 28 gallons. Everyone survived. 0 aircraft lost. 32 enemy aircraft destroyed. Mission success. But the real victory was fuel management. 12 P-38s had flown 1,800 miles and returned safely. Using Lindbergh's technique, the mission proved the concept. Extended range was achievable. Japanese targets previously out of reach were now vulnerable. Lindbergh climbed out of his cockpit. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft. They counted bullet holes. None. They checked engine condition. Perfect. They measured remaining fuel. 38 gallons. Exactly as Lindbergh predicted. Colonel McDonald walked over. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at Lindbergh. Then he spoke. "You engaged that Zero." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Lindbergh nodded. McDonald asked why. Lindbergh explained. His element leader was in trouble. The Zero had position. Lindbergh made a tactical decision. Save the pilot. Save the fuel that would be burned searching for him. Basic mathematics. McDonald understood. But understanding didn't change the rules. Lindbergh was a civilian. Civilians don't shoot down enemy aircraft. There would be paperwork, questions, investigations. McDonald made his own tactical decision. He wouldn't report the Zero kill. Officially, the mission destroyed 31 enemy aircraft on the ground. 0 air-to-air kills. The pilots would keep quiet. Nobody would talk about Lindbergh's dogfight. It never happened. Lindbergh agreed. He didn't need another medal. He didn't need recognition. He'd proven what he came to prove. His fuel technique worked. The extended range was real. The mathematics were sound. That was enough. McDonald shook Lindbergh's hand. Then he walked away. The incident was closed, officially. But every pilot in the squadron knew what happened. America's most famous aviator had shot down a Zero at age 42 while operating as a civilian, 17 years after his Atlantic crossing. The legend had grown. Word spread fast. By the evening of July 28th, every P-38 pilot at Hollandia knew about the Amboina mission, 1,800 miles. Every aircraft returned safely, 32 enemy aircraft destroyed, and the mission used a fuel technique taught by a 42-year-old civilian. The skepticism evaporated. Pilots who'd dismissed Lindbergh as a relic from 1927 were asking him for personal instruction. How exactly do you lean the mixture? What manifold pressure works best at different altitudes? How do you calculate fuel reserves? Lindbergh spent the next 3 days conducting individual training sessions. He flew with different pilots, demonstrated the technique, answered questions. Within 1 week, the entire 475th Fighter Group had adopted his methods. 5th Air Force Headquarters received McDonald's mission report on July 30th. The report emphasized the extended range capability. P-38s could now reach targets 900 miles away and return safely. That changed the strategic situation dramatically. Japanese bases at Halmahera, Morotai, and southern Mindanao were suddenly vulnerable. Previously, those bases operated with impunity, too far for American fighters. Now they were within range. 5th Air Force Commander General George Kenney read the report twice. Then, he sent a message to every P-38 squadron in the theater. Adopt Lindbergh fuel management techniques immediately. Mandatory training for all pilots, no exceptions. The training program rolled out in August 1944. Lindbergh visited 8 different squadrons. He flew demonstration missions. He gave technical briefings. He answered the same questions repeatedly, but he never complained, because the results were undeniable. Average P-38 mission range increased from 1,200 miles to 1,900 miles. Fuel emergencies decreased by 60%. Ditching incidents dropped from 3 per month to 0. Pilots who'd been losing aircraft to fuel exhaustion were bringing their planes home safely. The technique was saving lives. Lindbergh calculated that between July and December 1944, his fuel management methods prevented approximately 50 P-38 losses. That meant 50 pilots survived who otherwise would have died or been captured, 50 families who got their sons back. But the technique's impact went beyond survival. Extended range meant new tactical options. 5th Air Force began planning deep penetration strikes against Japanese targets that were previously untouchable. On September 15, 1944, P-38s from the 49th Fighter Group flew a 2,100-mile mission to Balikpapan oil refineries on Borneo. The mission would have been impossible 3 months earlier. The P-38s would have run out of fuel 300 miles short. Using Lindbergh's technique, they reached the target, destroyed 14 Japanese aircraft on the ground, and returned to base with fuel remaining. The Balikpapan raid demonstrated what extended range meant strategically. Japanese commanders could no longer assume distance provided safety. American fighters could reach anywhere. Lindbergh continued flying combat missions through September. Officially, he was still a civilian observer. Unofficially, he'd become part of the squadron. He flew 25 combat missions total between July and September 1944. Most were long-range patrols. A few involved combat. Lindbergh never officially claimed any kills beyond the 0 on July 28th, but pilots who flew with him reported at least 2 more probable kills. A 0 damaged in August, a Japanese bomber possibly destroyed in September. Lindbergh didn't keep records. He wasn't chasing an ace status. He was testing fuel techniques under combat conditions. Every mission provided data. How? Did the engines perform at different altitudes? How did combat maneuvering affect fuel consumption? What was the optimal balance between speed and endurance? Lindbergh treated combat flying like an engineering problem. Collect data, analyze results, optimize performance. The Japanese noticed the change in American fighter operations. Intelligence reports from September 1944 showed Japanese confusion. How were American fighters reaching targets so far from their base? Japanese analysts calculated P-38 range at 1,300 miles maximum, but American fighters were appearing 900 miles from the nearest Allied airfield. The numbers didn't match. Some Japanese officers theorized the Americans had developed new external fuel tanks. Others suggested the P-38s were refueling at secret forward bases. Nobody guessed the truth. The Americans weren't using new technology, they were just flying smarter. One pilot optimizing engine performance had changed the tactical balance across the entire Pacific theater. By October 1944, Lindbergh's work was complete. The fuel management techniques were institutionalized, training programs established, technical manuals updated. Every new P-38 pilot learned the efficiency cruise settings as part of basic training. The technique Lindbergh developed in July had become standard operating procedure by October. United Aircraft Corporation was satisfied. General Kenney was satisfied. Lindbergh could have gone home, but he stayed through December, not to teach, not to fight, just to fly. Because after 17 years of civilian aviation, Lindbergh had rediscovered what made him famous in 1927, the pure challenge of flight, pushing aircraft to their limits, solving problems nobody else could solve. At 42 years old, Lindbergh wasn't past his prime. He was still relevant, still capable, still the best long-range pilot alive. He returned to the United States in January 1945. No parades, no press conferences, no public recognition. Lindbergh preferred it that way. His wartime contributions remained classified until 1970, Most Americans never knew he'd flown combat missions. They didn't know about the fuel technique. They didn't know about the zero kill. Lindbergh's World War II service was invisible, by choice. He'd had enough public attention after the Atlantic crossing. The fame had destroyed his privacy. His son had been kidnapped and murdered in 1932. The tragedy was directly connected to Lindbergh's celebrity. Too much attention. Too many people knew where he lived. After 1932, Lindbergh avoided publicity. He worked behind the scenes, technical consultant, test pilot, advisor, never the public hero. But the P-38 pilots remembered. They knew what Lindbergh had done. He'd doubled their combat range. He'd saved dozens of lives. He'd shot down at least 1-0, probably 3, at age 42, as a civilian, while teaching them how to fly more efficiently. The combination of technical expertise and combat skill was unique. Most technical advisors couldn't fly combat. Most combat pilots didn't understand fuel management theory. Lindbergh bridged both worlds. Pilot and engineer, warrior and scientist, the same combination that made his 1927 Atlantic crossing successful. Technical planning plus flying skill plus absolute determination. After the war, the United States Air Force studied Lindbergh's fuel management techniques extensively. Engineers at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base conducted tests on P-38s, P-47s, and P-51s. They confirmed Lindbergh's numbers. Operating engines at 2,000 to 2,100 RPM with reduced manifold pressure and lean mixtures increased range by 35% to 42%, depending on aircraft type and altitude. The technique worked on every piston engine fighter. Why hadn't anyone discovered it earlier? The answer was institutional inertia. The Army Air Force taught pilots to fly at specific power settings. Those settings worked adequately. Nobody questioned them. Nobody experimented, until Lindbergh arrived and asked why pilots were burning 100 gallons per hour when 58 gallons would work. The lesson was applicable beyond aviation. Institutions develop standard procedures. Those procedures become doctrine. Doctrine becomes unquestionable. Then someone from outside the institution arrives and questions everything. Sometimes the outsider is wrong. Sometimes the outsider revolutionizes the entire field. Lindbergh was the outsider who revolutionized fighter operations in the Pacific, not through new technology, not through increased production, just through better technique, flying smarter instead of harder. Modern aviation still uses variations of Lindbergh's fuel management principles. Commercial airlines operate at maximum efficiency cruise settings. Pilots learn to lean fuel mixtures at altitude. Engine manufacturers design power plants with optimal efficiency curves. The basic concept Lindbergh demonstrated in 1944 became fundamental to aviation. Nobody remembers that a 42-year-old civilian taught it to combat pilots during World War II. The technique is just accepted practice now. But someone had to discover it first. Someone had to prove it worked. Someone had to teach it to skeptical pilots who thought a civilian couldn't teach them anything. Lindbergh died in 1974 at age 72. His obituaries mentioned the Atlantic crossing, his wartime work with aircraft manufacturers, his conservation efforts in later life. Few obituaries mentioned his Pacific combat missions. Fewer still mentioned the fuel management technique. The zero kill remained classified until after his death. Historians who studied Lindbergh's life focused on 1927, the famous flight, the instant celebrity, the American hero. But Lindbergh's real legacy might be July 1944, when he proved that expertise matters more than age, when he showed that civilians can teach military pilots, when he doubled fighter range and saved 50 lives using nothing but mathematics and engine theory. If you've ever wondered whether one person can change an entire war's trajectory, the answer is yes. But probably not the way you imagine. Lindbergh didn't win battles. He didn't shoot down dozens of enemy aircraft. He didn't lead invasions. He taught pilots to burn 40% less fuel. That's it. Simple, boring, technical, but that 40% fuel savings enabled missions that were previously impossible. Those missions destroyed Japanese aircraft that would have attacked American forces. The ripple effects were enormous, all because one civilian questioned standard procedures and proved there was a better way. The P-38 Lightning flew combat missions through the end of World War II. The aircraft's long range, heavy armament, and twin-engine reliability made it ideal for Pacific operations. But the P-38's true potential wasn't realized until Lindbergh optimized its fuel consumption. Before July 1944, the P-38 was a good fighter with limited range. After July 1944, it was a strategic weapon that could reach anywhere. The aircraft hadn't changed, the pilots hadn't changed, only the technique changed, and that changed everything. Today, aviation museums display restored P-38 Lightnings. Visitors admire the twin-boom design, the powerful engines, the .450 caliber machine guns. But the real innovation isn't visible. It's not hardware, it's knowledge. The understanding that engines have optimal efficiency curves, that fuel consumption can be managed, that standard procedures aren't always optimal. Lindbergh brought that knowledge to the Pacific Theater in 1944, and 50 pilots came home alive because of it. If this story changed how you think about expertise, innovation, and questioning authority, hit that like button right now. Every like tells YouTube this story matters. These aren't just war stories. They're lessons about how change happens, how institutions resist new ideas, how outsiders sometimes see what insiders miss. Hit subscribe. We're bringing you forgotten stories like this every single day. Real people who changed history through intelligence, not just courage. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Germany, Japan. Our community is worldwide. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Charles Lindbergh's second impossible achievement doesn't disappear into history.